Hello, my name is Chime Obuji. I'll be going over the Home Case Mixer software tool. It is well known in the industry that home health providers operate under a very heavy burden of financial pressure. As a result, maximizing the billing for home care services is critical to home health providers. The process of reviewing a large number of documents about a patient's episode of care and selecting accurate codes from these systems, according to carefully specified guidelines, is often a very time consuming manual process that requires familiarity with these guidelines and the ICD 10 coding system. Not many home care electronic medical record systems provide the detailed and readily available kind of case mix analysis needed to quickly ensure you are capturing the patient's clinical situation, their case mix, relevant comorbidities, and maximizing your reimbursement. Rather than looking to replace such a system, which might have capabilities in other areas that are important for your business, a web based coding solution allows you to perform this analysis independently and on any device with a web browser. The interface for this software is very straightforward. There is a text field where you can enter a comma separated list of ICD 10 codes, or you can look up these codes by providing their descriptions. And you also provide information about the admission timing of the episode directly below. You can also provide an OASIS XML document or an archive of the document that has the ICD 10 diagnoses along with the data elements in the OASIS assessment that provide a functional score, which also affects the case mix. Now, you can, for example, look up codes by entering a partial description of the code or the diagnosis. For example, start typing the name of a disorder and get a list and pick from that list a particular code I want to select for entry. It'll then replace that description with the actual code directly in the text field. And then it also add a comma so you can separate the fields you've entered in that way so far with the comma. So let's enter another one. As you can see, once you enter it, it'll put the code there. You can enter these ICD 10 codes in this way if you have a description of the disorder from another clinical system or clinical documentation of the patient you're doing the coding review for. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'll enter a predefined list of ICD 10 codes and demonstrate the case mix analysis of these codes. Once I've entered these codes, I will select a particular admission timing and click submit. And this will be submitted to the server, which will return immediately with an analysis of these ICD 10 codes provided. And the section immediately below will show you the valid PDGM ICD 10 diagnoses from what you entered, the ones that, amongst those that are valid, that is. Now, if you enter a code that is not a valid ICD 10 code, it'll list it right here, for example, and let you know the code is not in the PDGM model or an ICD 10 code itself, this R0.0 code, for example. Also at the bottom, if you provide a ICD-10 code, for example, that is a valid ICD-10 code, but is not part of the PDGM model, it'll let you know by displaying it down here that it is not a relevant code for analysis. The section directly below the place where you enter these fields will list all these valid PDGM ICD-10 diagnoses, starting with the actual code. Then it'll give you the description of the code. And when you hover over this second column, it'll provide information about the chapter and subchapter this code is a part of from the ICD 10 distribution, as well as the range of codes in that subchapter or chapter. And this will be the case for every valid PDGM ICD 10 code. And in some cases at the bottom there, you'll see it'll provide also any synonym information from the ICD 10 distribution. For example, N18.6, end stage renal disease, has a synonym of chronic kidney disease requiring chronic dialysis. The third column will tell you the clinical group for each ICD 10 diagnosis. For example, this first code, G82.52, quadriplegia C1 to C4 incomplete, is within the clinical group neurorehabilitation. And some ICD-10 codes will not have a clinical group, for example. And finally, this last column will give information about comorbidity interactions or whether or not this particular diagnosis is a comorbidity just by virtue of being part of the codes provided for analysis. And this is primarily given by showing the comorbidity group for each of the codes if they are in a comorbidity group. So this first code, quadriplegia C1 to C4 incomplete, is in the neurological 7 comorbidity group. And when you hover over these groups, it'll give you the full name of the group. It'll also tell you the other groups that diagnoses in these groups interact with. That is, if you have diagnoses from these other list of groups, then it could cause a high comorbidity adjustment to be included in the case mix analysis. And finally, if that particular diagnosis or the existence of this diagnosis can cause a low comorbidity adjustment by including it as a secondary diagnosis, it'll give you this icon here to indicate that. So this first one is such a diagnosis. This second diagnosis, end-stage renal disease, which is in a renal 1 comorbidity group, the group that is called chronic kidney disease and end-stage renal disease, doesn't interact with any other group and is not a diagnoses in this group are not low comorbidity adjustments or will not cause a low comorbidity adjustment. Now, at the bottom here, you will see a section that describes or characterizes the different clinical groups that you could have as a result of the codes you provided. As the principal diagnosis represents the reason for home care, the episode is assigned to the clinical group associated with the principal diagnosis. And this section below displays the possible case mixes for each scenario where a particular clinical group is assigned. And within the clinical group, this is determined by several additional factors: the level of functional impairment, the level of comorbidity adjustment, if there is any, and the admission timing. And this section, or these sections, if you will, show various information about the case mixes you can find within the group. For example, in the scenario where the clinical group is wound, so if the principal diagnosis is this one, for example, L89.153, pressure ulcer of sacral region stage 3, then the clinical group would be wound. And within this section, you will see the range of the functional scores that result in a low functional impairment being assigned, or a medium functional impairment, or a high functional impairment. It also shows information about any comorbidities that you could have within this group if the principal diagnosis causes the clinical group to be assigned, and there are other diagnoses that can cause a high or low comorbidity adjustment. It'll indicate it right here. For example, in this first group, it lets you know that if you have another secondary diagnosis, for example, I12.0, which is hypertensive chronic kidney disease with stage 5 chronic kidney disease or end-stage renal disease. If you have that code also, and G82.52, the first is in the circulatory 4 comorbidity group, and the second is in the neurological 7 comorbidity group. If you have these two, then you will have a high comorbidity adjustment. And this information is for the scenario where this is the clinical group, where wound is the clinical group. It also shows you detailed information about the actual case mix groups for each combination of these factors, along with the case weight for each. So, for example, within this clinical group, if, for example, L89.153 is selected as a principal diagnosis, if the functional impairment is high, if the functional score is 53 or more, and there is a high comorbidity adjustment, that is, for example, I12.0 and G82.52 are included as secondary diagnosis, then the weight, the case mix weight, will be 1.3491, and it also gives you the HIPS code associated with that case mix. These clinical group sections are shown roughly in decreasing order of possible reimbursement, with the earlier tabs representing those that are likely to result in a higher case weight and therefore a higher reimbursement. So the next example is neuro rehabilitation, which is the group that will be assigned if the principal diagnosis is I69.351. In this scenario, you will not have any high comorbidity adjustments, but if you include the code L89.153, which is in the skin 4 comorbidity group, you will have a low comorbidity adjustment. In the next group, MMTA, cardiac and circulatory group, you'll see a different set of scenarios that will cause you to have a high comorbidity adjustment or a low comorbidity adjustment. Now, in this example, we entered the ICD-10 codes directly or we searched them using a description, but you can also provide an OASIS file to the case mix analysis. And in this case, the analysis is essentially the same, except the functional score, or rather, in addition, the functional score calculated from the OASIS data elements submitted will also be included in the analysis. And the case mixes for functional levels that don't apply will be excluded. So, for example, we will select an OASIS XML file and submit it. So this is for a different patient. You've selected the OASIS file or a archive of the OASIS XML document, and you'll have the same kind of analysis as before, the PDGM ICD-10 diagnoses listed here above. But you'll see that another difference, or the primary difference, is in this clinical group section that gives you information about the case mixes for the MMTA respiratory group. It also includes the actual score calculated from the OASIS data elements. The score is 12, and therefore you're going to be assigned, or the case mix will be assigned with the assumption that it's a low functional impairment, since the score is within the range of 0 to 33. And the case mixes within this section will only include those that are relevant for the low functional impairment. Low, low, low. You don't see the high, and you don't see the medium. If you're interested in using Home Case Mixer to improve your clinical coding and reimbursement, please contact us in the information shown below, and you can become an early adopter. We have an early adopter program for people who sign up for use of this software in the early part of its release. And thank you. And there's other capabilities that this software has that I have not covered, but this is the primary functionality of the software.